Welcome everybody to this webinar on the elections of 2024 and what they mean for climate change. We have certainly had a lot of elections recently. The majority of the planet apparently is voting this year, and we are interested what that does to climate change policy. To answer that question, we have a very illustrious panel around me. I'm Sam Fankhauser, Professor of Climate Economics and Policy at the Smith School, but the illustrious panel is on the screen. We have Rachel Kyte, who is now a professor in practice at the Blavatnik School here at Oxford, but has done many important things in her career. She was a vice president at the World Bank at the time of Paris. She was the head of Sustainability for All. She was senior envoy at the UN. And she was dean of the Fletcher School, and I'm sure many more things that I don't have time to mention. Also on the screen, we have Chris Skidmore, a recovering MP who stood down from Parliament, I think it was in January, and is now sort of enjoying his next career, but is still very much sort of in tune of what's happening in the UK and no doubt further afield. Here in the room with me, we have Professor Tom Hale, Professor of Global Policy, also here at Blavatnik, and the co-director of the Oxford Martin School Programme on Net Zero Regulation. Last but not least, we have Dr. Sugandha Srivastav, a British Academy Fellow and a good colleague of mine here at the Smith School. Sugandha and I are also part of a programme called Climate Compatible Growth, which is sponsored by the FCDO. So this is us. And what we thought we would do is we go around the globe, picking out some of those elections that have happened and sort of speculating or debating informedly, I would say, what they mean for climate change. And obviously, we start in the UK. I will, for each one of those geographies, start with a sort of a hopefully sufficiently provocative statement that triggers a discussion. For the UK, Chris, I will turn to you, and my provocation, as it were, to you is this. We've had, for the time of climate policy since 2008, have a huge degree of bipartisan consensus. It sort of seems this election has destroyed that a little bit. There was a deliberate attempt to politicize climate change, and it's hard to see whether that genie can be put back into its bottle. We still have a large majority of people who support climate action, but it seems to be more politicized than it used to be. What's your reaction to that? Do you think we still have enough consensus in the UK?
Well, I think part of the challenge is how that opposition is now mobilized and vocalized is very different from 2008. That we have a vocal minority that use every channel available to them. And we've seen in the UK, the creation of GB News, our equivalent of Fox News, now creating content that is deliberately focused at undermining the energy transition. Even the Telegraph now use net zero as clickbait and look to drive traffic forward. So there's other reasons why certainly media outlets are trying to potentially destabilize or undermine the success of the energy transition. I would say, regardless, in spite of all this, the energy transition continues to move forwards at a pace, partly because those very markets the Telegraph once believed in simply are acting as markets. So we are seeing 20% of cars now are electric vehicles, 1 in 5. When I signed net zero into law 5 years ago, that was 1 in 20. So there are certainly ways in which we are moving forwards. What we need to do, the sweet spot for the new government, is align policies and incentives around how to deliver successfully in the next 5 years, where they have their mandates, opportunities for voters, for households to see and feel the change as if it's something that's going to make a difference to their lives. Now, that could be to do with making them sort of wealthier with more money in their back pocket as a result of cheaper bills. It could also be actually from a place-based perspective, demonstrating that in their local community, life is improved in certain ways by establishing energy projects, community projects. And I think there's just going on the one vector of money and price alone, it shouldn't be sufficient. But I would say, and I said this to Rishi Sunak in the past, and I campaigned not till I was blue in the face because actually I left the Conservative Party, that actually this was a huge mistake for the Tory Party to abandon action on climate, because actually when you look at the breakdown of the results from this general election, it was actually in seats facing the Liberal Democrats in the South, where the Tories threw away their reputation on climate. And as a result, it wasn't reform that got through. They only got 5 seats. It was the Liberal Democrats who won over 70 seats. So understanding the dynamics means, and I know it shouldn't be the most important factor, but this is the way politicians think. If you want to win back seats, you want to hold power for the future, you have to ensure that as part of your coalition building, you involve climate policy.
The new government obviously has very explicit aspirations on climate, which go beyond what the old government had. One of them is a carbon-free power sector by 2030. Do you personally think, Chris, and then I'll ask everybody else, do you think that's feasible, or are they setting themselves up to fail?
It will be feasible only if this becomes a central government mission led from the top. If we currently have the existing governance frameworks in place, led through a department, it will fail. But we have this ability now, as Ed Miliband talks about, a forcing mechanism to think through urgently what is happening already today. We have seen the policy statement lifting the ban on onshore wind. So they seem to be determined to move extremely fast. But we will know in the next 100 days or not whether this mission for 2030 will fail. Because if they do not put in place some of the critical architecture needed, including reforming the planning system, we won't be able to achieve it. Ultimately, I would like to just say, it's quite a techie point, if they fail to appreciate the importance of flexibility and reducing demand on the grid, then they will also fail, because currently we need to build out 6 times the amount of infrastructure needed than what we've built in the last 30 years to deliver a net zero grid. If we can focus on reducing demand through greater flexibility at the edge of the grid, taking on board the lessons from things like Project Leo that was established in Oxfordshire, we only need to build out twice as much infrastructure. It's absolutely critical. I wrote a report last week called At a Crossroads. This is the decision point. This is the tipping point. That if we don't get it right in the next 100 days, we'll fail in the next 5 years. Okay, very good. Let me ask the other panelists, just a sort of a gut reaction. Which ones of you think we will have net zero power by 2030? Let me look in the room. No hands come up.
I'll add, I think Chris is absolutely right. It's feasible, it's hard. And the thing that I think the government really needs to keep very much center of mind is how to bring people along with them on this journey. That's where governments that are trying to really go fast on climate policy are often running into barriers. Building the number of transmission lines that we need to build to get 2030 100% renewable energy is going to be a big change to people's lived experience. And so we need to be talking now about how that affects energy bills, how that makes people more security, and how it's creating jobs. And if that's not part of the day one narrative, then I think it will be much harder than not. Okay, so Sugandha.
Yeah, I'll just add that this country in the past 7 years has moved from 35% coal to 2%, and that happened in 7 years. So actually, I think things can happen, as Chris said, with the right policy apparatus in place. And I think it's very interesting that Labour has put forward the idea of GB energy. If that really is used as a vehicle to invest in novel clean technologies, I think that this power grid can be absolutely world leading. And in many ways actually already is when we look at the statistics on how quickly coal was nearly phased out.
Let me bring in Rachel on GB energy. You worked at the World Bank, which is in a sense a global version of, or a part of the World Bank is sort of a global version of the aspiration that GB energy might have. What's the role of those sorts of organizations in making transformations, bringing the market along? What would you say is the role of GB energy?
So I think using the public balance sheet to signal clear priority, set clear guardrails, and then crowd in and attract private investment into energy priorities, and giving a clarity that this is going to be the priority for the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years, not the sort of regulatory reversal or the hesitancy that investors have because they're not quite sure, do we like onshore wind? Do we not? What are the rules? How is it going to work? And that's plagued the UK for the last few years. So I think the direction of travel being clear, using public money to crowd in private money, this is what the recipe sort of menu cards are for how to do this in other parts of the world. There are other innovations that can be used in fiscal policy, and it'll be interesting to see how much Rachel Reeves becomes a partner for Ed Miliband in doing this. But I also think there is an opportunity where the UK may benefit from some of the insecurity in other neighbouring markets while we watch the sort of octogenarian egg and spoon race going on in the US and the lack of clarity there, even with an Inflation Reduction Act. And we see hesitancy over exactly how the EU is going to move forward, despite the commitment to 55 there. Maybe the UK suddenly becomes a country known for pragmatism and stability again, and maybe that will also help that public investment attract the private investment necessary.
We might be a world leader on climate change again, who knows? We talked about energy so far, or electricity, which in many ways is the easy bit of the decarbonisation. Obviously, they're the much harder bit: buildings, agriculture, infrastructure. Chris, what would you like to see on the difficult to abate sectors, and is Labour on the right track?
Well, you're absolutely right. I think when you look at the CCC's balanced pathway and the progress, it's a report that I think is going to be published next week, the 2024 version. The grid makes up 12% of emissions that needs to be reduced. Transport at 33% is the highest, and then it's buildings at about 24%. So if we just took transport, the new Transport Secretary has said that Labour intends to nationalise the railways. Now, I'm not a trains expert. I'm not sure what is needed to take that forward and what that's going to mean for investment. But if there is going to be now national investment in the railways, let's make sure that they have conditionality placed on that. Electrification that began a process in the coalition years, then came juddering to a halt. We've electrified 260 miles of rail in the UK. They do that in a single week in India. So I think there are key areas of transport where we keep focusing on having to deliver alongside the grid the electrical infrastructure that's needed for transport. I would say also, public transport. We've seen what's happened with ULEZ. Thankfully, the Conservative attempts to try to demonize ULEZ as being a net zero policy have failed. Sadiq Khan, in London, got re-elected with an improved mandate. But remember, at the time last year, Keir Starmer said, "Oh, I think you should think again about ULEZ," and had a bit of a wobble. And what we don't need is Labour making a bit of a wobble when it comes to public messaging on transport. So I think really thinking through this, and obviously there's difficult decisions, as they say. Politicians have to make around electric vehicle charging and the road tax for the future that should be made quite soon, because otherwise it'll be too late to actually identify how to make the transition across effectively, so that sort of those EVs that are currently not going to pay road tax, how do you make sure they grandfather a system in future? And then on homes, one of the biggest scandals we've seen, I think, happen is that we have built homes over the past 5 years, 1.3 million homes that will need to be retrofitted at the cost of the householder eventually. We must put in place a decent building homes for the future standard that ensures that every new home is a net zero home for the future, in addition to focusing on retrofits. And I know that obviously Labour has rowed back slightly on its plans for retrofit in comparison to what they set out in the 28 billion pound package. They haven't also said that they would commit to the heat pump target for 2035. We need urgent clarity on what that's going to mean, because ultimately, if your boilers are still on sale post 35, we are not going to be able to meet our net zero targets of 2050 if we are still selling gas boilers that are still operational post 2050.
Okay, before we leave the UK, let me just ask the other panelists, just one policy that you could ask the new government to do. Just one. What would it be?
Well, let me focus with my international hat on the global leadership point that Rachel was speaking to. So there is a real need for looking beyond what happens domestically, and domestic leadership is by far the most important building block of international leadership. But there's a crying huge gap in the international climate policy space for a bit of ambition. And so I would hope that this new government will think about the climate problem, not just here at home, but also in the broader context, and use what it's doing at home as a tool to unlock more action from others and to build up some of that international cooperation, which is so sorely lacking.
Okay, we will move on to the rest of the world soon, but Sugandha, your one wish.
Yeah, well, my one wish is that there's much more investment in transmission and distribution infrastructure, because I think the UK grid can be a world leader in terms of showing how high renewable energy penetration can be in the electricity mix. But part of making that work is to have enough transmission infrastructure and also grid scale battery storage. So I would hope that that investment happens, and hopefully through GB Energy.
Okay, very good. Rachel, one wish that will make it 3, and Chris has already had lots of wishes.
Well, I think that just to switch more to the adaptation and resilience of the UK, there's significant reports coming out on flooding in the next few weeks. We just had Operation Helios in London, looking at the resilience of London to an extreme heat event. The government, it's a total government approach. Our health service is vulnerable to extreme weather, so is our education system, and we know that the countryside is. And we also know that, as you could see from the results that Chris was talking about, that there is a vote for nature that is very much to be analysed in the election results from last week. So a total government approach and an engagement with the public about what it's going to take for us to become resilient.
Very good. And Chris, you seem to want to have your wish, so go for it.
Yeah, just one more. Labour promised during the election campaign they would set up a net zero delivery agency, and some of it's been established in Australia. Yeah, that was one of my key recommendations the previous government never took up in the net zero review. So getting that governance piece right, as I mentioned, making sure it's not just the home of one single department. How do we get all departments to work together? That's what a delivery agency will seek to achieve. So getting that off the ground as soon as possible is my number one wish.
Very good. And with that, we leave the UK and start looking outwards, and we start with Europe, given that Europe is close by. And obviously Europe has had lots of elections, some with surprising, unexpected results. But broadly, what has happened is that the mainstream views have been losing ground, and sort of populist views, whether on the right or on the left, have sort of gained prominence. My provocative statement to initiate the discussion, it sort of strikes me there's almost sort of like a switch in dynamics. For many years, it used to be, fringe parties complaining about the political establishment not doing anything about climate change. We now sort of seem to have the fringe complaining to the establishment that they do too much about climate change. So it's an interesting switch there in terms of how climate change has become a sort of an established, recognized problem, at least by the mainstream. Question then, to what extent was that just a sort of slightly little bit naive, and we haven't fully baked in climate action? So I don't know, Tom, maybe, what's the future of the Green Deal, for example? What's the future of European climate policy?
So I think actually, so I might disagree slightly. I think we haven't seen in the European elections a huge mandate for governments to go back on their climate targets. We have seen in some places a rise in support for far-right parties or right-wing parties that are suggesting a different approach to climate action. But they have not won elections. They've done better than they have done before. And fundamentally, the center held in the European elections more than it lost. I think that's quite significant, because I think the expectation, at least for many of us before that, was actually a much worse outcome. And for example, the surprising results in France, are kind of like what we saw here, a huge surge for the left, kind of analogous to what the UK saw with a rise of support for the Green Party and for Liberal Democrats. So there's a real vote out there for not just continuity on climate action, but actually greater investment in making the world safe for us all. So I think that's, to my mind, a really much more nuanced picture than the sort of media narrative coming into the European elections put out. The big takeaway for me, though, is that if governments, as I said before, aren't serious about making climate action something that provides tangible benefits people feel in their pocketbooks in the day one of climate policy, it's not going to be successful. And so I think I hear in the French elections, the European elections across Europe, a real need to turn to the just transition perspective and to make that the first point of the Green New Deal, not the Green Deal, rather, Freudian slip there. The Green New Deal, right, has this deeper just transition element to it. I think that needs to be put back into the center of European climate policy.
So climate policy, in a sense, was collateral damage to sort of broader trends, but it has survived the elections. Rachel, would you agree on the just transition story?
Yeah, I think that the populism on the far right and populism on the far left are protest movements, right? They're against the state, against the status quo, against elite capture, and that also has become the issue, I think, on climate. So, notwithstanding the fact that they didn't quite, get the electoral results that perhaps they wanted to see, we also see that when the far right goes into government, its vote kind of collapses. So we saw a Dutch election where you have a significant rise in the Farmers' Party and the far right, and then in the European elections, that vote kind of collapsed, because once they're in power and they're not just protesting, they're actually pursuing governance, then maybe there isn't quite so much there. Same in Portugal. I think what's worrying would be in Germany, where the youth vote, and of course 16 and 17-year-olds were able to vote, with that youth vote transferred from the Greens to the far right without stopping in the middle. So that's something for centre-left, centre-right to think about. It's also something for the Greens to think about after having been in a coalition government. So I think that's important for the UK as well, and for France, to not misinterpret what that double-digit vote for the Reform Party is in the UK and what the rising vote for the Greens are in the UK. So you've got to govern, and as Tom said, you've got to govern in a way that good policies for the environment and for climate and for nature are affordable policies that improve your prosperity and make you safer. And that's where the governance challenge lies for parties wherever they are in the spectrum.
So interesting. So the Greta generation is more heterogeneous than we often think. Chris, does it matter what Europe does for the UK?
I think so. I think in terms of the supply chain opportunities and future partnerships, it's a huge moment by which we need to work together to create that wider infrastructure. For me, however, there's a fault line in the EU Green Deal that maybe only widens unless we have sort of clarity, which is, are we delivering this trillion euros of investment to decarbonize, to reduce emissions, or are we doing this to create good new local jobs? Because the challenge for me, and it's not clear, is obviously the play to the right, and obviously potentially on the just transition, is to prioritize local industries, to put content requirements, regulations on the proportion amount of technology that has to be produced in Europe or in certain countries, whether the batteries or EVs or other sort of infrastructure, against China. And I don't think the EU has been clear enough how it sort of wants to sit in the relationship between where it places itself between the US and China. Obviously, we're going to be waiting for the US election to see where the EU and European countries sort of place themselves. But until there's greater sort of clarity about what does Europe want, does it want to be a leader in decarbonisation, or does it want to slow that transition because it will hold off, actually just developing the solutions we need, because it won't have those solutions unless they are regionally created. That, I think, is something that these elections this year potentially go back into the sense of, rather than energy independence, energy sovereignty, which is the worst kind of thinking, which is the sort of everyone trying to build out their own energy transition separately, baked in the model of their own local industries. Yeah, there will be difficult decisions that have to be made. And I'll come back to Wales, sorry, to bring a UK example. Port Talbot Steel, potentially the green transition has saved half the jobs there, as opposed to costing them all. But the unions have already said to Labour, you're going to be watching what happens here. We are against potentially we will take industrial action because they see the green transition as imposing this being on blast furnaces. And it's the same up in Scotland with the GMB union, opposing, well, being in favour of new oil and gas licenses. So let's not just assume that the left equals pro climate action, because also that sense of protectionism exists on the left as well as the right. And navigating that and putting aside protectionism for what is needed to just deliver on climate is something we need to refocus our efforts on.
And sort of that reference to protectionism is a good segue to look at the emerging markets and bring Sugandha in. Emerging markets, we've had elections in India, in South Africa, in Mexico. We probably don't cover Russia, but there was something called an election there, whatever it might have been. And it's quite sort of heterogeneous. Mexico elected a recognized climate scientist, a former member of the IPCC, with a sort of a citation record that could put her on this panel. But the thing that probably India and Mexico have in common, less so South Africa, is that they have quite populist sort of leaders, populist presidents. Sugandha, can populists do climate change?
Yeah, so I think this is a very interesting moment for emerging markets because we see that they all have state-owned enterprises that are highly engaged in fossil fuels, and there is huge sort of domestic mobilization around protecting domestic and indigenous fossil fuel resources. Yet at the same time, the economic levers are very, very clear. In India, solar is 2 rupees per unit, while coal-based electricity is 6 rupees per unit. So there is a sort of pressure cooker environment that's building. And the result of that has been policy inconsistency. So the low-cost, affordable renewables are driving greater adoption. India has the 4th largest base of installed solar capacity in the entire world. And yet, at the same time, the BJP government is not committing to any language around phasing out coal. Although if you do the maths on their renewable energy targets, that is what it would amount to. So what we're seeing is that the narrative is very sensitive. It's grow, grow, grow. Whether that's clean that grows or dirty that grows, it doesn't matter. We just want to grow. But then there's this inherent contradiction because some of these targets will mean that fossil fuels get pushed out. The other point I want to make is that a lot of targets in emerging markets are driven by geopolitical posturing rather than climate science or even economics. And I think this strategy might be reaching its expiry date very soon because emerging markets are becoming very different from developing countries in terms of their per capita emissions, their political influence, and their economic position in the global arena. Already, India's per capita emissions are twice as high as the African average and 7 times higher than the average of low-income countries. So as climate impacts intensify, I predict that there will be a point when the poorest nations might say, we know the West has to pay. We've known that since 1992 when the UNFCCC process started. But guess what, emerging markets, we think you need to foot some of that bill as well. And that's the dynamic I think the politicians of emerging markets, India, South Africa, Mexico, need to gear up for.
Rachel, you have a lot of global experience over many jobs. How do you sort of see that development climate tension working out post all those elections? You're on mute, Rachel.
In none of these elections has climate explicitly been an issue, which I think in and of itself is interesting and perhaps for another webinar. In the case of Mexico, Claudia Sheinbaum is a climate scientist who is the political protege of a left-wing populist who has not pursued the energy transition in a way that I think would benefit Mexico. And so exactly as just been said, how she fronts up to Pemex and then picking up the speed in the energy transition will be fundamental for Mexico's economic competitiveness. I think that we see there's sort of the new BRICS, the new sort of BRICS sort of phase 2, the large middle income countries really trying to not subscribe to a world where, you know, the West it tells everybody what to do and doesn't do it itself. And so I think you're starting to see this very interesting dynamic in the G20, where we've had Indonesia, India, Brazil, and now South Africa, before it goes back to the US, basically building up a theory of change around what needs to happen, what the trade and investment agenda needs to be, and then sort of back to the G7, okay, are you going to play that role? So in actual fact, for climate, some of the most important things that will happen in the next year are the growing pace around the discussion of the reform of international financial institutions, the discussion on whether or not we will deal with the indebtedness, debt distress, and liquidity problems that are facing many countries that have to make massive investments in their energy transition. And I think that climate has become everything, and everything is about climate. And so it'll be very interesting to see how David Lammy not only repositions Britain in the world slightly differently than the last time Labour came to power in 1997. It's a very different world, but how Labour understands the economic geography, having been completely changed by the renewable energy revolution and by some of the economic conditions that many low-income and middle-income countries find themselves in. So this is a game of geopolitics, which is very different in very many aspects, and climate resilience, as well as the energy transition and the transitions that follow from that, will be at the heart of it.
Very good. Before we move to a forthcoming election, the one in the US, Tom, Professor of Global Climate Policy, what does all that mean for global climate policy?
Well, I think what we saw with the recent emerging economy elections were really more sort of status quo than big disruption. India, no big change. Indonesia, fairly consistent policy pathway from the previous government. In Mexico, maybe a hint of a new approach on renewable energy, although, as Rachel said, probably not a big fossil fuel phase-out agenda to develop there. And then, of course, in South Africa, a real question mark on whether a coalition government now really unpicks the nexus between coal mining, power generation, and the African National Congress to see if there's a way forward to reform that sort of very vested set of interests. But the upshot for global cooperation is, I think, as Rachel was starting to say, really about how this much more multipolar world decides to cooperate or not. And it'll really be, I think, on the hand of the new governments coming to power in Europe and the United States, which we'll get to momentarily, to see how they're going to manage that. Is it going to be, here's some places we can work together, here's how the trade policy and the finance policy can work to help us all deliver climate goals, or is it going to be kind of conflict? And I think that's where the next election we're going to talk about is going to be quite decisive.
Okay, very good. And before we move to the US, I should say I've seen first questions coming in from listeners, so keep them coming. They arrive here safely on my iPad, and as long as I don't press the wrong button, being assured they will stay there. So keep them coming, and we will come to your questions in a couple of minutes. But first, we want to say something about the United States. And my provocation there is that, or it's probably a question, a provocative one, but sort of my sort of observation is that a second Trump presidency would be less detrimental than the first one because the market has moved on. There's a certain amount of resilience built into the system. Certain things are less reversible now than they used to be 4 years ago, or certainly 8 years ago. We look at Texas, which is a Republican state with 25% wind power. So politics and policy can be hugely detrimental. But my naive hope is it probably it might be less damaging than it would have been 4 years ago. Rachel is shaking her head vigorously, which is what I wanted to achieve. Rachel.
Yeah, Trump 2, if it comes to pass, will not be like Trump 1. Trump 2 is unbridled, I think, ability to use the instruments of state in the pursuit of an agenda, with a Supreme Court that has in recent weeks unpicked the ability of the federal government to say what's safe for people when it comes to environment regulations, a Supreme Court that can undermine democracy in terms of who gets to vote, who gets to have a say. I think you have to remember that this is about a just transition, and that piece of Paris that we often overlook, which is that you can't leave people behind. The United States is actually highly vulnerable to climate change as well. If you live in an inner city here, in the kinds of heat that we're having today at the moment, and on the West Coast, it's a dangerous place to be. If you can't insure your home across now, many states across the South and the East Coast, what does that do for your economic prosperity? Trump will just wipe most of that away with a Supreme Court that will back him. And I think it's a consequential election. And of course, there's the international aspect of this, which is, a US that dallies around with its membership of the UNFCCC, with the Paris Agreement, its membership of different UN bodies, its engagement in the World Bank and the IMF, and under Project 2025, all of these are things that the Trump administration will step away from. And so even though it's a multipolar flat world, can you really imagine the kinds of cooperation that we need in the places where we have to cooperate if the US takes its ball and goes home again? I'm not so sure. But my real worry is for ordinary Americans who, if Trump wins, will be less resilient, not more, to the impacts of climate change that they're already feeling.
Right, that's fair enough. So markets, I argue, are more resilient. The political system is less resilient. That's probably true. Tom, let you come out on that.
I think that's right. I think the Trump 2.0 will be more unleashed than Trump 1.0 if it comes to pass. I think, as you say this, and there is more, we're further down the path. And so some of the big changes are about when, not whether. So the policies in the Inflation Reduction Act were designed explicitly for different administrations to come into power. And there's a lot of Republicans who benefit a lot from them. And so we'll see which of those are immediately swept away and which aren't. I think the biggest danger is where the federal government has discretionary authority, for example, on EPA's regulation of power plants or of car standards. That will go very quickly. And many of the Inflation Reduction Act provisions actually require implementation by different executive agencies, for example, the Internal Revenue Service, the tax authority. So there'll be a lot of damage there. When Trump came into power in 2016, there were no states of the United States that had a net zero target. Today, there are 13 that have that locked into state law. So I think there's a lot more, the states and cities have gone a lot further down the path in ways that will be difficult to take forward, to rip up. That said, though, already this election has taken a supposedly progressive state, New York State, and reversed a key decision around congestion pricing in New York City because of the uncertainty. So there's a real cost around that. The biggest impact, though, I think, will be, as Rachel says, on the international side. I think that cooperation around the financial aspects, unlocking the flows of money we need to unlock to drive implementation is the biggest challenge we have in the second half of this decade. A United States federal government that's not working on the World Bank reform, that's not working to shift the trading system to be more climate friendly, it's not shifting to unlock the power of the IMF to direct things, is going to make it much harder for the world to get there. So I think that's the biggest impact.
Okay, which is a nice segue to move to your questions. And you've been nicely patient, but the questions have been coming in. And I start somewhere in the middle with a question from Sarah Schoenhardt, because it builds on what you just said. If that leadership is starting to disappear from the US, that climate leadership, and perhaps from the EU, can the UK step into the breach and become a true climate leader again? Where shall I start? Chris, you're a UK climate leader.
Well, I think the government can signal, improved leadership by creating a network of climate envoys. We've not had a climate envoy in the UK for a while. We saw the impact that people like John Kerry and Jennifer Morgan have on the international stage. We can't have a minister doing this sort of role in the future. We do need to have our own envoy, and I think that's something that an early day decision should happen now. I would say also that unless Rosebank is reversed, you're going to have this sort of odd situation where a Labour government will continue to allow licenses that were permitted or decisions that were taken to stand. And I think it's going to look very odd optically if Rosebank still now sort of is allowed to push ahead. There's still lots of legal challenges. But I think also that Cumbrian coal mine is still wrapped up in a legal challenge, trying to signal that whatever happens, that these will not go ahead if they're timed out, would also be critical, because the rest of the world is watching and understands that you can come up with policy frameworks, you can lead in trying to help the rest of the world decarbonize. Our entire strategy was demonstrating that we led by example, and if we can't lead by example, then we're not going to the ability to make the change elsewhere. I would say on things like Mexico, on Indonesia, on some of those other countries, they need help now on bringing forward an end date for new oil and gas. Colombia has joined the Federal Oil and Gas Alliance and said, please help us make the case for setting that end date. And that's something I think that we should be working on, but we can't be part of that club if we're still taking forward major oil and gas projects well into the 2050s.
Tom, the UK as a climate leader?
I think there's a lot the new government can do. It's not going to be a US scale or European scale or Chinese scale or Indian scale global player, but it's going to be able to use innovation in a way that could be very powerful. Let me give one concrete example. The government is now committed to put into place a carbon border adjustment mechanism following the EU and thinking about how to basically ensure that imports into the UK aren't sort of dumping carbon without regulation. What a brilliant opportunity for the UK to think about how to join its trade policy, its climate policy, and its foreign policy into something that could be coalition building. So what if that revenue that comes from this tax on imports is reinvested in least developed countries' adaptation strategies? Or what if it's invested in the Green Climate Fund? Or what if it's given to a kind of better purpose and is filling up the coffers as the EU is doing? So this is a kind of simple policy, but one that could really begin to establish a new coalition around this issue, that could begin to rebuild trust. I think in that kind of nimbleness, a re-energized UK government could find ways to build powerful coalitions, even though it's not going to be able to shift the position of the major players.
Okay, so with a little bit of imagination, the UK can be a climate leader. Sugandha, a question for you, actually, then I open it to the panel from Damien Carrington about good examples of climate policies that properly account for inequality.
Yes, I mean, there's plenty of examples of climate policies that do account for inequality, and particularly when there is a carbon tax, some of the policies utilize the revenues generated from the carbon tax to finance green infrastructure, or even to redistribute those revenues progressively towards the communities that are most affected. There's also what India, is trying to push and needs to push more on, which is rehabilitation of coal mining areas, so that those lands can be restored back into a state where you can have agriculture and pastoral livelihoods, etc. I think one major point that I want to make here is that I think the just transition narrative has been captured by a very, very small group of actors. When we think of just transition, most of you hearing me now will think about coal workers. But in India's context, coal workers account for 0.2% of the labor force. It's a tiny fraction. And actually, the people affected by air pollution due to coal mines is 80% of our entire population. So the just transition narrative, and when we talk about making climate policy less unequal, I think that's important, but we need to remember the bigger picture, that climate change itself and environmental degradation is a bigger driver of inequality on a scale that's frankly orders of magnitude higher.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think the term just transition has evolved from what it was in Poland when it was invented. I forgot which COP it was, when it was about coal workers, but it's now a much more broader concept. But Rachel, maybe, do you have an example?
I mean, I think that one of the big issues is the way in which fossil fuel subsidies are removed, so that you protect people on low income, so that they can secure access to clean energy, but that you're taking the substantial subsidies away from the middlemen and everybody else in the equation. And there are examples. I mean, there's about 45 or more countries that have embedded support for access to energy into their social safety net systems. We know that if you can put cash into the hands of women, they'll purchase the clean cooking solutions they want, rather than sort of subsidizing Total or others to use less than 0.01% of their profits in order to have a couple of CSR projects on cooking. So I think there are lots of things that can be done that build the sort of protection and resilience in. And I think we're going to see more of that also in terms of nature, in terms of the food transition. We haven't really talked about that, but you know, over the life of this new British government, or of all of the elections that we're talking about, your ability to secure access at an affordable level to a healthy diet, right, for you and your family is increasingly imperiled by climate impacts. And if you think that removing fossil fuel subsidies is hard, well, we know that getting into food subsidies is also going to be very hard. So there's a lot of work. I think there are examples around the world, and Damien, happy to take a longer conversation offline.
Okay, very good. Let's move back to the UK and to Chris. A question for you, Chris, from Lara. What does the success of the Green Party in the UK elections mean for climate policy?
So I just quickly want to add in a good policy framework where I've seen success.
Good. You need good examples.
Which is around making things local. That I often say the future of energy and success of delivery is focusing through a local lens, as we will see from the constituency results that give far more green champions the ability to focus on these at a local level, and obviously to lobby for potential investments. One area I think we've seen just transition is the one onshore wind turbine that's been built in the UK, in England in the last year, which is like Ambition Community Energy. That's going to deliver cheaper renewable energy to 3,000 homes in the Lawrence Western area of Bristol. But it's also spending £1.7 million on a new community hall that is going to also provide debt advice and other sort of support mechanisms for that housing estate, as well as the overall turbine producing about 88,000 tons worth of CO2 over its lifetime. So that is just one example of then how you can take a community with you on this journey. And I think what we'll see, where my previous government sort of failed, was really to incentivize community action, community energy. When I did the net zero review, I went around the country and it was clear to me there are areas of the country, whether it's Oxfordshire, whether it's Brighton, whether it's Bristol, that are increasingly going green. And they're doing so because actually the advocates in their local area are making a really compelling case for what can actually happen and what the change could be in the local area. And that's not an advert for the Green Party. It's just showing the reality of what's happening. Bristol has gone from being the centre, Bristol Centre, central Bristol went green. It went green not just overnight, over several years, as I saw councillor after councillor go from Labour to Green. And you can look around the country, and this is going to happen. The Greens are following the same pattern as the Liberal Democrats. It's a groundswell movement. It's not an ideological one. And what they're doing is really cleverly identifying what climate policies can be enacted in their local area, making the change happen and demonstrating to the people they can be trusted to deliver. Yeah, I think the Greens have learned their lessons that they shouldn't necessarily just be ideologically left-wing, and they're actually being pragmatic about making some of the change. So actually, there's one policy example of actually where I think the Green Party is putting into practice a bottom-up strategy around some of the policy opportunities that are delivering the just transition. And as a result, they're being rewarded at the ballot box.
Very good. I have a difficult question next from Michael, who brings together two of the big themes for those elections, or one big theme on climate change. Climate change and migration. How do the two things link in political terms? Who wants to have a go at that? Sugandha wants to have a go at that.
I can have a go at that. I think basically we're seeing a huge amount of climate change migration that's also being driven by agriculture becoming unviable in many parts of the world. It's driving internal migration in India. And often we talk about international migration across country boundaries, but even internal migration is a huge issue, especially across states that have very different linguistic and cultural norms for big countries like India. I think this is basically going to drive a large political wedge. It's going to show how we have a really, like what Tom says in his work, this transnational problem, which requires coordination and the type of leadership that a lot of Western governments are reneging on, frankly. So I think it's a very sad story. I also want to mention one thing. I lived in Fiji Islands for a while, so let's not forget about the South Pacific here and the existential risk that is there for South Pacific countries. There are people in the South Pacific Islands that are actually buying up land across Australia and New Zealand to actually secure their future generations' livelihoods. So I think that for the Pacific Islands, where I spent a part of my childhood, the conversation is 10 years out from what it is for the rest of the world because of the existential nature of the crisis.
Very good. And that brings me neatly to the next question from Kathy, directed at Rachel. So why don't we ask Rachel, but others might want to come in. And that is the link between climate impacts and the energy transition. So what will heat waves and extreme heat do to the energy transition in terms of public safety, the grid, and so on?
Well, I think, yeah, so extreme heat is how most people are experiencing climate impacts. It's happening in every continent, it's happening in every country. And so it's sort of, the question is, I think there's one question, which is, what does this do in terms of concentrating policymakers' minds? Of course, the second thing is that people, food, medicine needs to stay cool. We need to be cool for our own safety and comfort and our productivity. Obviously, the medicine and vaccine supply chain needs to be cool and safe, and so does the food supply chain. So what we're seeing is energy demand spikes already, a significant energy demand increase in many different economies. So sorry, there was a bit of feedback there, so I hope that's been resolved. So we see these incredible energy demand. We're also seeing, of course, huge energy demand spikes now as a result of AI, which again, probably a separate seminar. So one of the things that we have to solve for is how to be able to help people stay safe, keep the food chain safe, keep medical and vaccine supply chains safe without sort of punishing people for wanting to be cool and comfort. So being able to resolve how people can be safe in an extreme heat environment is something which is going to have to be front of mind for hospital administrators, for departments of health, and total government, as I said before. At the moment, we're seeing the real reaction coming from city leaders. So Sadiq Khan's Operation Helios last week, we see city leaders from Phoenix, Arizona, through to Medellin, to Melbourne, to Athens, to Freetown, Sierra Leone, as sort of really taking a sort of total city approach to how to keep people safe and cool. But that's going to have to start translating into federal government policy. That's going to challenge the insurance industry. It's going in Europe and North America, not just in the emerging markets where we know that most assets are uninsured. And of course, in the recent heat waves, we've started to see a lot of innovation. So we've started to see new products introduced to the market. For example, in India, an experiment with an insurance product that allows people who lose their livelihood because it's too hot to work to be able to insure themselves for those days lost. So I think extreme heat is just, in some respects is the spear, the tip of the spear. It is where people experience and suffer from climate impacts, perhaps more pervasively than anything else. But it hasn't yet translated into government-wide policy and thinking. And I think that we're going to see a lot more of that over the next few years. I just want to say that Simon Steele, right, who is the coordinator of the UN climate entity, is, I think yesterday was on his way to his ancestral home in Grenada and to the small islands there, which were completely wiped out. I mean, there's barely a building standing. And so, we don't need too many more reminders of the devastation of extreme weather, but we do lack the kind of sort of urgent total government response.
It's a very, very sort of stark reminder indeed. The only thing I would add is it's not just heat. where the link to energy will come. We don't know, for example, what climate change will do to wind speeds. So there's something that we have to find out. But we have time maybe for one last question from Dave Vetter, who is a former student here at Oxford in our master's course. And he's interested in trade policy, and maybe that's for Tom then. He wants to know what the net zero risks and opportunities may be on trade policy for the UK.
So I think the global trading regime is really trying to rethink its purpose. For a long time, the purpose of trade was liberalization of more trade, and sort of had this self-fulfilling logic. And I think we've seen not just a climate agenda, the nature agenda, sustainability agenda, but also the just transition agenda, or the need to keep people in good work, really trying to driving thinkers in trade. And Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, the head of the WTO, has said this very clearly, that trade needs to reorient itself to think about how does it serve the goals society is trying to achieve. And so there's a big rethinking happening there. As I said before, I think the UK, as with a new government, can really be at the forefront of that conversation. The UK is now outside of a large trading bloc, but that does mean there are some opportunities to think about innovative trade policy. The Carbon Border Adjustment Measure innovation I suggested could be one way to do that. But what about trying to think about driving this longstanding need for a deal on liberalization of environmental products that's been gridlocked in the WTO for a long time? What about trying to think about how a grand package could allow developing countries to see a future for themselves by being part of green supply chains, not just being locked out by these high green fortresses you see coming out in Europe? And so I think there's really a lot of scope there for an innovative trade policy to be a new venue for a reinvigorated UK government to show some global leadership. I'm excited to see what they might come up with.
Very good. And sadly, that is all that we have time for. That hour passed quickly. We covered the globe in record speed. So all that remains for me to do is thank our panelists, Rachel Kyte, Skidmore, Tom Hale, Sugandha Srivastav, and thank everybody who tuned in for their questions and for their attention. Thank you very much indeed, and have a good rest of the day.